Welcome, everybody. I'm Katy Wallace. This is a talk about resistant starch benefits. I'm a licensed naturopathic doctor in Madison, Wisconsin. My business is Human Nature LLC, and I'm giving this talk today in partnership with the Willie Street Co-op. So besides giving these free monthly lectures, I offer private one-on-one sessions to Willie Street Co-op members at the co-op location, and I have some virtual slots available each month. So they're available on a limited basis. We just have a handful of these reduced rate slots available each month. But if you're interested in working with me, you can certainly reach out to me in order to sign up for one of them. I'm currently scheduling for September for these special rate sessions. I hope you'll join me next month when I talk about food-based cleansing on Tuesday, August 26th at noon. So we'll talk about how you can promote detoxification and reduce inflammation through your food choices. And this is based on a book that I wrote that was published in 2022, The Body Tune-Up, which takes you through a 6-week series. And every fall, I take a group of people through a workshop where we do this food-based cleansing process. I'll be advertising scholarships beginning in August, so stay tuned for that. And I hope you'll tune in for the free webinar about it in August also. This talk is for health education reasons only and should not take the place of medical advice. So today we're going to talk about what is a resistant starch, why is it so cool, why is it important, and how can you get this into your daily routine? How much do you need to eat in order to get some of the benefits we're talking about? So these are some popular pictures of resistant starches. Examples would be rice, if it's cooked and then cooled down, green bananas, oats, similarly either raw or cooked and then cooled, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and especially beans and lentils. There are quite a number of additional foods that are high in resistant starch, and I'll talk about some of those as we go along today. But these are some popular ones. So if you're reading about resistant starch in the news, these are typically the sources of starches they're talking about. Of course, there's trade-offs to just about eating every food. So just because these are great in resistant starch doesn't mean that they're good for everybody. And I'll talk about some of the nuances about eating grains and eating these other sources of starches as we go along. If you have any questions for me, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll have some time for question and answer at the end. So the reason that it's important to cool these starches down, especially like the grain-based ones and with the tubers and the lentils, etc., those do increase resistant starches as you cool them, because when you cook the food, it creates one type of starch. That starch tends to feed more inflammatory bacteria. But if you allow the starch to cool, it changes the structure of the starch and it feeds more beneficial bacteria. And we'll go into that, but that's why people are often very curious. Why the step? Why do you have to cool it down? That's so weird. And so that's why the distinction is made that you don't just want to be eating a lot of rice and thinking you're getting resistant starch. You actually want to, for many of these foods, have that step of cooling them down. And then you can reheat them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So a resistant starch, these foods are high in resistant starch because it's a type of starch or fiber in the food that's resisting digestion. So most starch, like the starch in hot rice, is going to get absorbed right away, broken down into glucose or blood sugar and absorbed as energy. But a resistant starch is not going to get absorbed right away. It's going to resist digestion, thus the name, and it's going to be fermented by bacteria in the gut, thus the multiple benefits, including benefits for blood sugar control. And so it's a very critical food for the beneficial gut bacteria. It's been in the news a lot. This is an example of an article about Ruminococcus bromii, which is one of the more common bacteria in our gut that can break down resistant starch. And what scientists are finding about a bacterium like this one is that they will ferment the food ferment the foods high in resistant starch to the point where they're making these byproducts that feed the rest of the beneficial gut microbiome. So these are kind of these keystone species that are leading to other benefits, not only for the tissues in our gut and kind of the whole system in the gut, but also for other beneficial bacteria that are then imparting other benefits to us. So they kind of have like a chain reaction of benefits. This picture came from an article, Health Benefits of Resistant Starch, a review of the literature. And I think it does a good job of summarizing many of the benefits in the scientific literature about resistant starch. So we start with resistant starch here, picture. They've got some examples, right? They've got the potatoes, the beans, the green bananas. Maybe those are some garbanzo beans, some oats. And we take the resistant starch of that. When we eat that, it gets digested by the bacteria in the large intestine or the colon, which are fermenting it and then creating something called short chain fatty acids or butyrates, which is a word, if you're not familiar, you're going to hear me say over and over. Short chain fatty acids and butyrates are beneficial gases, and they have all these really good effects. They affect and feed the colon cells. They create a healthy mucosal lining. They support glycemic or blood sugar balance. They are prebiotics to a lot of other good species. They help with weight management. They help reduce inflammation and lead to better cholesterol and lipid metabolism. They also lead to better gut-brain connection and cognitive health, and some other random things that I've pulled together for you today based on the literature. So you can kind of see when you eat the food, it resists digestion, they create short chain fatty acids or butyrates, multiple benefits coming from that. So that's basically in a nutshell what's happening with resistant starches. To summarize again, they're feeding the short chain fatty acid producing or the butyrate producing bacteria. These are gases that feed our cells. Our body loves these byproducts from resistant starch fermentation by the good bacteria. And then we get all sorts of gut barrier benefits and gut biome benefits and body system benefits. They've been linked to reducing inflammation, lowering our risk of cancer, lowering type 2 diabetes and heart disease, primarily because they're increasing our insulin sensitivity, which is good. This has been shown primarily just in animal studies, and improving our blood sugar control. So you can read this, it's been in the news. Here's another excerpt from the Cleveland Clinic, which had like a nice summary of the different benefits of butyrates for the gut. But basically, the butyrates, these gases get absorbed by our colon cells, and it helps them to continue to communicate together, secrete mucus, attract good bacteria that are helping to encourage a healthy gut barrier and a healthy gut lining. So it can help a lot with reducing the likelihood for things like leaky gut, for example. This was another interesting study that came out last year about how for every 10% increase in this type of bacteria in the gut, there was a fall by at least 25 or up to 25% in hospitalizations for infection. So when they look at populations of people who were at high risk for infection, whether or not that infection put them in the hospital or not, seemed to rely in part on whether or not they had these good bacteria that like to eat resistant starch. So just to get a slight 10% increase in bacteria, that's something just about anybody could do just by eating more of the resistant starches, to help, and having a healthier lifestyle to help improve your health outcome overall. So I thought that was kind of cool, especially with concerns about hospitalization for COVID or long COVID, for example. There's also a number of studies showing that there are a lot of gut-brain benefits. And so I gave a talk several months ago about the gut-brain connection. You can check that out in my news tab. And here's an example of a study that was in the Nature Metabolism Journal where they reviewed all the literature on the connection between the gut biome and cognitive health. And here I have highlighted that the short chain fatty acids, or the butyrates being produced by good bacteria in the gut, are implicated in gastrointestinal function, blood pressure regulation, circadian rhythm regulation. In other words, how well you're waking and sleeping, your energy level during the day, and neuroimmune function. Most notably, alterations in the gut levels of these short chain fatty acids are associated with anorexia, Parkinson's disease, obesity, chronic psychosocial stress, and autism spectrum disorder. So there's a lot of information that scientists are finding where it seems to be a very positive benefit to have these short chain fatty acid producing bacteria in your gut. And so what do you need to do that? You need to have some resistant starch, seems to be the takeaway. Here's another study that showed not only do you get short chain fatty acids from eating resistant starches, but you can feed some special gut bacteria that help curb sugar cravings. It turns out that a specific bacteria, Bacterium vulgatus, makes pantothenic acid, or vitamin B5, for us by fermenting resistant starch fibers. And then the higher your B5 levels, the more it curbs your sugar cravings. And so overall, if you've got more of this bacteria in your gut because you're eating well and have a healthy lifestyle, then that's going to help reduce insulin resistance and help you stay on a healthy diet and help reduce potential for disease. Another study showed that resistant starch could potentially reduce gallbladder formation. And I just looked at this briefly, and I'm not sure that they've shown this in human studies yet, but there were multiple animal studies where they've shown that if there's more resistant starch in the diet, then they're thinking animals and humans will change the bile acids secreted by the gallbladder, and this reduces the likelihood of gallstones forming. So kind of another interesting takeaway on digestive health from having a little more resistant starch in your diet. There are other foods besides those high in resistant starches that can feed the butyrate producers. There have been a number of studies on broccoli and broccoli sprouts showing that it helps feed beneficial butyrate producers. So broccoli is not particularly high in resistant starch, but it's another really valuable food for the gut biota. They found that when the people were on a broccoli diet, it enhanced the concentration of bacteroides group, especially butyrate producers. So not everyone is going to want to dial in this much, but for those of you that do, there are specialty lab tests that can tell us how you're doing with your butyrate producers. And the one I like to use is called a GI map, and I use the lab diagnostic solutions for that. And it's really a deep dive on your good bacteria, your bad bacteria, what's happening with your intestinal health overall. And just to show you an example, you can see the good bacteria in this page of the lab report, and I've highlighted some of the butyrate producers. So for example, in this person, you can see, well, they don't have much of the Akkermansia, which is one of the butyrate producers. They got a little more of this Faecalibacterium one, and maybe they're kind of borderline in the Rosaburia. So a takeaway might be eating a little bit of resistant starch every day for this person to help with increasing those butyrate producers. On another page of the lab report shown here, this is where they show opportunistic, or some of the bacteria that are known to be autoimmune triggers. And so you can see if someone is high in those inflammatory species, then it helps me as a practitioner to decide, okay, here's what you need to be doing. We need to both maybe increase your butyrate producers and help take some action steps to reduce these inflammatory strains. And a lot of that can come through just changing the diet. So besides the resistant starches, other foods that help feed butyrate producers are lettuce, chives and spring onions, zucchini. We talked about broccoli, beets, rutabaga, asparagus. There's a lot of others, but I just wanted to highlight some of the ones that I know about. When you're making a resistant starch, you certainly can increase the level by cooking the food, cooling it. When you cool it for at least 24 hours in a refrigerator, and then you may reheat it or you can eat it cold. So not very high tech, but these are the steps involved in making more resistant starch. So some examples: cooked and cooled sweet potatoes, or white potato, or blue potato, cooked and cooled rice, cooked lentils. Lentils and beans already have a lot more resistant starch than the other starches I've mentioned. But if you cool them, you actually do increase their content of resistant starch even more. So it's not as necessary to cool those to get the benefit, but you definitely can cool them too to get more. And I do like to tend to encourage people to maybe choose lentils as a resistant starch. I work with a number of people. Some of them are more sensitive or just really trying to optimize their health. And so I like the lentils as a choice because it's higher in protein, whereas these other options have very negligible amount of protein. But like a serving of lentils, you're going to get maybe 15 grams of protein, whereas these other starches we're talking about, it's going to be 5 or less grams. And if you're trying to get, 80 to 90 grams of protein a day, then it matters what you're eating. So I like to point to lentils. I also really like to recommend winter squash and pumpkin because a lot of people are trying to optimize their gut health and keep their insulin levels lower. And you can eat a lot bigger serving of winter squash. You can eat just more squash and pumpkin in general and maintain good blood sugar control than you can eating a lot of rice or potatoes regularly. And certainly it's going to depend on the person. Someone who's younger, has a lot of muscle, is going to be able to power through a higher carb content potentially than someone who doesn't have those qualities. But still, it's important for everybody. Everybody can eat squash and pumpkin if they like it. And in general, all of us, to keep inflammation under control, want to keep the number of carbohydrates we're eating kind of within a range that's healthy for us to avoid health problems. So you don't need a big serving. You just need a spoonful. So that would be another key takeaway. You want to think you're really just feeding the bacteria. You're not feeding yourself these resistant starches in a way, right? So you can still have a low carbohydrate or even a ketogenic diet if you're trying to optimize some things from those therapeutic diets, and still have a bite or two of these to really maximize your gut microbiome health and diversify your gut microbiome. So a good practice might be to just have a couple spoonfuls at each meal. I took this picture. I was just thinking yesterday, oh, I should see what do I have, just to give you some examples of how I come up with resistant starches on a regular basis. I do more or less have a plan for my meals, although I don't write down a systematic meal plan or anything. I do plan out the dinners for my family, but beyond that, breakfast and lunch are just regular staples. And I do try to include resistant starches in most of, not all of the meals. So without further ado, here is a dal on the left that I pulled out of the freezer. That's why it looks like this. I had made a lentil-based dal a couple weeks ago, and we hadn't eaten it all. And so I just took the leftovers and froze them after a few days. And that helps me to kind of diversify, because I'll get tired of eating stuff after a few days in a row. So I could just, thaw this and heat it up and serve it again as a resistant starch at another meal. We almost always have rice around. Personally, I don't like to eat a lot of rice, but my husband and my kids like rice as a starch at meals. And so I'll often make enough so that I can save it. And then a couple nights later, I can reheat it and offer it to them. I tend to eat a lot of squash. This is a picture of a spaghetti squash I made a few days ago. I'll steam a squash. I'll cut it up and steam it and then save the pieces and then pull them out for my different meals so that I don't have to be cooking squash every day. This is a baked potato on the right. We'll often bake or grill potatoes on a weekly basis in our household. One of my kids is gluten-free, and so we'll use the potato as a staple for her lunches. And so I'll often make potatoes in advance. And then she is all excited about, yeah, let's, get a potato out and put some different toppings and fillings, get some fat and some protein in there. And obviously you're increasing the starch content by letting it cool down in the fridge and having it again on another day. And for me, this is kind of an emergency squash or emergency starch. If I ran out of my squash and I needed a quick starch, like I'm about to work out, I can have part of the potato or have it fill in my lunch. Whoops. So this is what a lunch would look like. This is what I just ate before having this lecture. I just wanted to give you guys an idea of how I put some of these principles that I'm talking about in these monthly lectures into practice. So this is a piece of acorn squash that I had left over from last night. I just reheated it in the toaster oven with this tuna salad that I made, where I combined a can of tuna with mustard and mayo to get adequate protein. It's so important to get your omega-3s. I've talked a lot about that in the lecture, but there's so much compelling evidence that the lower your ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, the healthier you are, and it reverses a lot of disease and dysfunction in the body because it's so good for mitochondria, so good for hormone signaling. Anyway, I digress from talking about resistant starches, but encourage you to eat a lot of fish and seafood. Obviously, I like to fill up on a lot of vegetables too. So I've got some fresh chopped celery, and then I put the tuna in these lettuce cups, which I just roll up and eat. And then I like these crunchy, high protein, high fat, epic pork rinds that are very flavorful. So I'm kind of getting the crunchy, salty bit, and I've got some Baja salt on my veggies over here too, just to help replace electrolytes. So just kind of an example of how you might incorporate resistant starch into a daily lunch or any other meal, really. If you haven't been eating resistant starches, you might experience a little bit of gas and bloating. This is really normal initially because your gut biome is probably shifting a little bit as you start to eat these foods that are feeding the new beneficial species. But if you continue to have gas and bloating, like I would say if it's lasting more than 3 or 4 days and it's really uncomfortable, it's more than just like a minor thing, then this is probably a sign of an underlying imbalance in your gut microbiome. You may have an issue like an overgrowth of candida or SIBO, which is small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, that needs to be addressed. So if you find that you cannot eat these foods, you need to address the underlying gut infection first in order to be able to expand and be able to eat more starches again. So there's a lot of things that are beneficial for your gut lining. I didn't want you to come away from this talk just thinking that resistant starch and starch is the only thing I need to eat to have, a healthy colon. Certainly there's a lot of studies supporting the notion that yes, it's very beneficial to eat resistant starch, but it's very complex. I wanted to oh, you know what? I started talking all about, this is what I wanted to talk about. I'll go back in a second. So it's not just starch that's beneficial. This study is talking about how a ketogenic diet, that is a high fat diet. So you wouldn't have very much starch at all in order to become ketogenic, suppresses cancer in the colon through the gut biome manufacturing long chain fatty acid stearate. So that works in that when you're not eating carbs, it boosts your long chain fatty acid or stearate production in your gut. This has an anti-inflammatory effect on your gut and reduces, they've shown, tumors and cancer. So very cool. So, how do you reconcile this information? I feel like that's kind of one of the real challenges today for somebody who's interested in optimizing diet and health, is like there's all these different messages. I would say there's clearly so much evidence that a ketogenic diet and low glycemic diet are optimal, particularly for people with cancer or people in other high risk health situations. So you can kind of marry the two concepts. You can follow a ketogenic or a lower carb diet and still have, a bite or two of resistant starch so that you're maximizing both benefits. Does everybody need to do that? No, I'm not saying everybody needs to do that, just kind of giving you an example of how you can add these different therapies together. All right, let's go back. Okay. There's a couple other things that help with butyrate producers too. Scientists have found that people that have higher cardiorespiratory fitness have higher levels of butyrate producers. So, the more you're exercising or the more you're doing exercise that's right for you, I would say, the better your gut. I think exercise is another thing that can be complex in terms of what's optimal. I don't think that the same type of exercise is optimal for everybody. For example, people doing long distance running or like a lot of cardio often have problems in their gut health because of the cortisol that you're making when you're doing prolonged cardiovascular exercise. And the cortisol is thinning the gut lining and causing a lot of gut problems for those people. Versus someone who's doing more resistance training. And those of you who have listened to my other talks know that I'm more biased towards weightlifting and resistance training because of the multiple health benefits. And you're not going to produce as much inflammatory cytokines or as much cortisol from weightlifting as you would with prolonged cardio. So I would always encourage people, you've got to look at the individual and find the right plan for that person. But in general, the science is saying the higher your level of fitness and health, the more butyrate producers you're going to have. So keep moving. Also, fasting appears to help improve the number of butyrate producers. And when you say fasting, that can mean a lot of different things. Some people do 24 or 34-hour fasts. Some people fast multiple days and then don't fast the rest of the month. Well, I work with both men and women, but I would say the bulk of the population I work with are women. And some women can fast, but most women, fasting is not as beneficial for them to fast longer than like a 14-hour fast, because we know there's probably multiple reasons, but at least now we know that women make cortisol more easily, especially as we age. And so if you fast too long, then you begin to make the stress hormone cortisol, and that can undermine the benefits of fasting and cause hormonal dysregulation. So I tend to suggest a fast that's just an overnight fast, maybe 14 hours from the end of dinner to the start of breakfast. Of course, it's going to vary for the person based on what's going on. But when you're fasting, if you can consistently fast and not eat at night, not eat a snack overnight, then it allows the butyrate producers to multiply. And so that's how we help diversify the gut microbiome by fasting. Okay, so today was just a short one. Here is the summary again of what we went through. When you eat resistant starches, it feeds the bacteria in the gut. They ferment the starch, and that has a lot of health benefits. It can have effects on neurotransmitters and cognitive benefits. It is creating short chain fatty acids or butyrates that are feeding the colon cells and helping them stay healthy. It is supporting healthy blood sugar balance, because rather than absorbing that glucose, that starch right away, you're prolonging it and feeling fuller longer. So it helps with glycemic balance and blood sugar control. You're feeding a lot of other good bacteria and helping with weight management and reducing inflammation, potentially even reducing gallstone formation by balancing the bile acids you're secreting in your body. So many, many benefits from the resistant starches. Remember, small amounts in an otherwise maybe optimized diet for your metabolism is fine. And don't forget, fasting overnight can also help, as well as regular exercise that's right for you. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you'll join me next month when I talk about food-based cleansing. And don't forget, I have the $55 one-on-one sessions. If you're interested, you can reach out to me.